Welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to be working on a little bit of a smaller quilt. As you can see, I have a couple of the recent holiday quilts that I've finished using the IntelliQuilter and the Bernina Q24. These are both holiday quilts. One of them is Winter Wonderland and the other one is Blank Slate, the pattern for the background, but the applique was called Gnome for the Holidays, or Gnome Sweet Gnome, I think. And I used Jessica's Twinkle on that one. Behind me I have a Halloween quilt, so the studio is always in a state of quantum flux as far as the holidays or the time of year goes. What I have on the frame, and you have seen it during the intro, was a Jacqueline de Jonge pattern, and about a year ago I did a video utilizing that quilt. It had 4 blank spaces in the corners that I wanted to add a little bit of something else to it. And so I used a Hoffman batik that was multicolored. It was a single piece of fabric. And I used an SVG file, a scalable vector graphic, from Applique Elementz. And the name of that pattern was Tapestry. So I used my own fabric and a cameo silhouette, downloaded the SVG file of Tapestry, and I cut out my own fabric. Now this SVG file was not from a quilting pattern, it was from an applique pattern from the Applique Elementz line. So as you'll see when I'm quilting, I tried to get the batik fabric to match the kit as closely as possible for the Jacqueline de Jonge pattern. I imagine that many people would want to custom quilt something like this because a lot of work went into the flying geese and all of the triangles. But to be perfectly honest, right now I don't have time. This has been on my to-do list for probably over 2 years to custom quilt it. I just don't have the time. I've got too many tops of my own making that are piling up, so I have to get some things off of the production line. So the 2 choices that I had to make were what kind of thread I was going to use, and I chose a variegated primary colored thread for the top, so it's going to change colors as it gets stitched out. It's an Isacord 40 weight. I also will use an Isacord 40 weight variegated thread in the bobbin. The backing fabric is pure white, as are a lot of the samples in the studio because they're all wall quilts. So part of that is utility, the expense of it, but part of it also is because many of these samples have a modern appeal to them, and the clean white backing just lends into that as well. The other choice I had to make was which quilting pattern was I going to use. And I think I've always known what I was going to do with this. I think I always knew I was going to end up just doing an edge-to-edge design. And because I used the Tapestry applique design on the 4 corners, there is a Tapestry quilting pattern that's very similar in its feathery flow, and that's what I'm going to be using on the quilt itself. So I already have my variegated thread loaded, and I have the bobbin loaded with the variegated thread, both 40 weight. That way I don't have to worry too much about the tension. They're equal, so I can just let the machine do its own thing with the tension. So I'm going to go ahead and get the pattern loaded and decide on what size I'm going to use the pattern at, and we'll get started stitching. As you can see, I have Tapestry quilt loaded onto the top. Right at the very moment it is not basted to the bottom roller. I will probably do that in a minute, but I just wanted you to be able to see the whole quilt as it is. It's not a very large quilt, and I have the IntelliQuilter pulled up to the front bar in the center. When you turn the machine on, it always asks you to do this. That's where it wants to be at start position. So I've gone ahead and done that, but when I get to the point where I'm going to start loading information, I'm going to move it back to its start position, because if there is a specific moment where it has to be back here, and I always get carried away and miss that, and then the quilt is not lined up to its start position. It thinks it's in this corner, but I will have it somewhere else, and so the whole quilt will be off. So I always take the head of the machine and I'll go ahead and move that back to the start position, and then I can go ahead and program in the quilting pattern and the size, and that will get me started. So we'll do that next. I have the bottom of the quilt on my roller. It just gives me a little bit more tension on the quilt, which I like. I'm going to measure this quilt. I know it's a square, and I already know that it's 48 inches. So when I go ahead and input the size, I'll probably put something like 50 inches. That will give me about an inch on each side that it will sew out. But I may minimize that since I don't have a lot of width here. So we'll see when I get there. So I'm at my main menu, and I'm going to design sew quilt, start new. As it always does, it's asking me if I want to replace what's in progress. Yes. Permanently erase it. Yes. Reset the time. Yes. So we're going to do a pantograph on this quilt, and I just made a mistake. I said mark on quilt, and I hit that. I'm not going to mark on the quilt because although I would be able to do the side to side, I wouldn't be able to do the length of it. So I'm going to enter rectangle manually. And remember I said it was 48 inches. I think I'm going to hit 49 for my width. And for the height, I want to make sure it goes far enough below so I can always snap it off if I don't need it. So I'll say 52. And you can see on the screen that's the visual representation of my quilt. And I'm going to go ahead and hit finished. I want to add a design, and I already know the design is loaded. It's an Urban Elementz design, and it's called Tapestry. So I could just go down to Urban Elementz, hit T for Tapestry. It's right here. I need to accept it for both the even and the odd rows. And you can see as it sews out, it leaves a pretty good gap in between each row, which I don't want. I want this all to blend together, so I'll hit the gap, and then I can just drag on the screen, which is having this fit into itself so it looks like an even flow. So I'm happy with that, but now I have to look at the height, and the pattern height on here is 19.5 inches, and I don't want that, so I'm going to go ahead and reduce it. So that has brought the pattern height down to 11.5 inches, which seems a lot more acceptable to me. And it looks like we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 full rows and 2 partial rows. So that's 9 different start over points for this. I'm fine with that. It's a small quilt. It won't take very long. So I'm going to hit finished. Transition type is continuous. We accept. We're committing to the transition, and we're getting ready to sew the quilt. We'll use Panto sequencing, and we'll select the first pattern, which is going to be this partial one up here. And I like to swap the start and end points on the other rows, but for the first one it's going to start here and end over there. We're going to alternate, tie off, and we're going to do the whole quilt. And you'll see again, it's a little hard to see, but it's light. It's kind of like a olive green and a Kelly green. They're showing you the alternate rows. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 start points, and I can go ahead and accept it the way it is and hit Sew Quilt, and it's at my first position. I have the machine on manual. I could go ahead and pull up the bobbin thread. And we'll go ahead and hit start, and we'll get our first row started. At this point, it's already finished the whole top row, so I can, it says I could cut the thread, but I don't really need to, but I could hit start, and it's going to go ahead and move to the start of the second position. And we're at the start now. I can go ahead and get the thread snipped from the top here so I don't get it caught in my stitching, and basically I'm ready to start again. The thread was already in good shape. I've got plenty in the bottom, plenty in the top. Equal weight on both the bobbin thread and top thread. They're 40 weight Isacord, and it's already stitching out the second row. The entire time for this quilt right now is 72 minutes, so it'll take just over an hour, and probably be an hour and a half by the time it's actually finished. But when I get down into the white, I'll move the camera in so you can get a little bit better look at the stitching on both the black, variegated colors, and then on the applique. I didn't actually have a thread break, but sometimes you have to stop and check. There is a sensor wheel at the top of the head of the machine that tells the IQ if there is a thread break, and sometimes that isn't spinning properly. I do have to wind the thread around that wheel twice to get it to move properly, but so far everything is stitching out good. I hope I don't have any further issues with the thread break sensor, but you can see we're stitching out. Where the pattern turns from red to green, that's where we know exactly where we're at. The crosshair is our exact needle position. And I like the IQ in that any adjustments I have to make are right here at the head of the machine, not at one end of the frame or the other. So I'm right where the action is with the command panel. I always imagined variegated thread as going to overpower the quilt, but I think think you'll see when I bring the camera in a little bit closer that the variegated thread is just adding one more layer of sparkle to this quilt. It is already a bright quilt, but I don't think the variegated thread is competing with that. I think it's just adding another really nice layer. Because I decreased the size of the design, I'm able to get an additional full row of the design stitched out here. So I'm already at my start 3 position here, as you can see on the screen. You should be able to see a little bit of the stitching on the background border here. And you can also see here, this is the Applique Elementz Tapestry pattern. This came in a 4-piece set. What I did was download the SVG file, which allowed me to use my own fabric and the Cameo silhouette to cut out this pattern. It also came with a printed pattern for placement guide. So I have that here in place. All I need to do now is hit start, and the quilt, the IQ is going to go ahead and take the machine into motion here. You should be able to see what the thread looks like now on both the black, the stripe, the piecing, and the applique in this particular row. Foundation piecing is a nice way to get really sharp points like this. If I tried to piece that just with strip cutting technique, they probably wouldn't be that accurate. I have just rolled up the quilt and it's time for me to realign. I have put the needle back down exactly in the spot that it just ended in, and I'll tell you what row that is when I get up on the screen. But I've rolled the quilt up, I've connected the sides, I basted the two edges, I'm back on manual mode, and now it's time to adjust the tablet and let the IQ know where I'm at. So I'm going to hit realign, and I probably have to be on this side. The IQ thinks I'm almost way up here at the ending of row 3, but where I'm actually at is the ending of row 5. So if I just touch the little crosshairs there and hit continue and OK, and now it's going to go down to my start of row 6, which is where it should be, and we'll hit start, and it's going to go ahead and do row 6, and we'll get started at the other end on row 7. We are on our 8th row, which is our last full row. Once this completes itself, I'll have just a little bit of filler on the very bottom. I adjusted the bottom of the quilt to compensate for my over measuring, which I like to have that in there anyway. So we have approximately 9 minutes left on this particular pattern. We are at the bottom of the quilt, and I'll let you watch this for a minute, but I'll probably edit a good portion of this out because it gets a little repetitious. But you go ahead and enjoy this, and I'll walk out front and see if I have any mail. Well, here we have it. That's another quilt off of the quilt frame using the Bernina Q24 and the IntelliQuilter. I can show you the back with the tapestry pattern. I have a couple little tiny thread knots that I have to clean up, but the variegated I think looks pretty good on there. And now all that's left for me, well, I will make the binding and machine attach it. I have a friend that does my hand whipping on the binding, and I'll also put a sleeve on this because this is not really a bed quilt. This would be more something I could hang on the wall. But I love the cheerfulness of the tapestry quilting pattern, which matches the tapestry laser cut applique pattern. I used a SVG file for that. And I mentioned earlier that I was going to the mailbox to see if I had any mail, and I do. I was anticipating this coming in, so I'm kind of excited. I haven't actually seen it in person yet. This is something that is old, and it's just a quilt top, and I'm going to probably do a video on this. I haven't mapped it out yet, but this is a vintage quilt top. Could be from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. It is one of my absolute favorite types of quilts, which is a red and green quilt. And I've read different kinds of history on these. This is a big one. So I will be using this as a future video if all goes well. I'm going to be doing a star pattern inside the star, and by that I mean a quilting design pattern that was designed for 8-pointed star, as these are. And then I'll do something else in the white, and then something around the block, and probably we'll need to do some little thing in the border here as well. But I'm going to be doing this vintage quilt with the IQ as well, and so we'll be doing blocks for this instead of an overall design. So that may be one video, it may be two, but that's something that I'm excited about, mostly because I absolutely love these red and green quilts. Red and green are my favorite colors. I love Christmas. These remind me of Christmas. It's my favorite vintage or antique type of patterns. I love these even more than Applique Baltimore album quilts, if you could believe it. And you know how much I love Applique. So that's it for us today. I'm going to go ahead and let this air out. Fortunately, it does not smell like smoke or animals, but it does have a little bit of a vintage smell to it. So I want to thank you for stopping by today, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.